Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode. Today we are going to be covering the following topics. All the timestamps are in the description below. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. So let's get started on these topics. How do you set up entity framework with SQL Server? So here what I have is I'm using a SQLite. So I really need this to be in SQL Server. So here, this is my local SQL Server. So you can see it's local. Currently, I just have the following databases. So what I want to do is I want to create a new database called school and add the following table to it and also update some initial data, which I have over here. Some of the first things we will do is look for the entity framework SQL Server. So I am on this website, NuGet packages. So you know, this is how all the packages are managed in .NET, NuGet.org, and you can search for SQL Server by using the search box over here. So Entity Framework Core and SQL Server. So the command that you need to use is this one. So I will simply click on this copy button under this tab over here, go on to File menu, click on to View, and then click onto the terminal. And I'm going to run that command I copied. So I'm going to just paste that command here. But before I do that, I need to change the folder to this console app, because if I run this here, you can see it'll come back with the error cannot find project. So I really need to be in this console1 folder. So what I'm going to do is just type in cd and change that over here to console1, and then I'm going to paste that command again, and this time it's going to install that, and it's finished installing. So then I can just close down the terminal and then back onto the web page. You can see how it's used. We're just going to scroll down here out of the usage section. We are going to copy this line over here. So I'm going to right click and copy, and then over here I can just comment out the previous line, which used SQLite, and paste in the SQL Server. Now my local DB is just core local, so I'm going to delete this bit over here, and the database I want is school DB, so I'm just going to copy that over here. Yes, it is trusted connection, so it's using Windows authentication. But as you can see here, I don't currently have any databases called school, so when I run this program, it should hopefully create that database. If I run this over here, but it's just running the program. Now here, what you can see this error to say connection was successfully established with the server, but the error occurred during the login process. This is due to the certificate chain was issued is not trusted. Because you're running this locally on your own computer, there are no certificates that are trusted. So what you need to do is just modify the connection string over here and around an extra one here called trust server certificates and set that to true. This is a security measure by Microsoft and nothing wrong with the entity framework itself. This is just improved security. We know we trust our own computer and our own server. So we just gonna say, yes, we're fine with that. And if I run this again, and there you go, I have output here of my students. And if I go over to my server and just click on the refresh button over here, and you can see there's now a database called school. And if I expand the school database and the tables, I should find a table called students. And if I select top 1000 rows, you can see that I've got the data that I wanted over here and the columns created here. And you can see the type of column. So that's an integer, varchar, max, and integer here. So that's how you swap by from a SQLite database to use a SQL Server. As I say, just a change of connection. That's all that's needed. You're off and running with SQL Server very quickly. This is the code first approach, which is there was no database created at the beginning. So all the database creation was actually done by Entity Framework based on the student class we defined and the database name we used here. So let's have a look at how would you add a column to your Entity Framework application. So here we have a student class. We have the ID column, we have the name column, and the age column. So now we want to add another column called city. If we have a look at our database, you can see the Entity Framework has created a table with the 3 columns that we have here. So one of the options that we have is we can use Entity Framework to add it by using something called migrations, which we will go through in another explanation. But let's have a look at what actually happened when we try and add a new column here. So if we have a look at this, and I'll add the column to the database itself. So here we just want to add the city column. So here I've got my statement written. So this is going to amend the table and add the city column. So if I were to run this over here, you can see it's executed successfully. And if I refresh this over here, and you can see we now have a city column. So if I go back to our application, but if I just run the application knowing that there is a column within the database that is called city, and let's just have a look at the city column. So it is allowed to have nodes, so this will be fine for existing data. So select on here, so you can see city for existing students is no. Okay, so if I run the application, you can see the column have been added and there's no errors. Now if I didn't have that column in there, and let's now delete this column, so we'll go here, select the column and delete. So we've now deleted that. So we'll add a property here for city. So So here we've added a property for city to this class. So now notice that there's no column code city within our database. So we just have ID, name, and age. So what do you think will happen when I run this code? So here we have a long error message. Right at the beginning, we have a line to say invalid column, name, city. So this column doesn't exist. So now what we need to do is if we go back to our database and add that column. So here we're going to run this, add the column, and then just refresh this over here and just make sure the column exists. Yes, it does. Go back to our code. And if I try and run this again, what you'll find is that you'll get another error message. So if we have a look at the error message, it's saying unhandled exception, data is null. This method or property cannot be called on null values. So basically we enabled that the database over here can accept nulls, but in C# we also need to enable that to accept nulls. So here we just added a question mark to make this nullable each type. So city can have null values. So if you remove that, then it cannot have nulls. So we'll just add that back in. And now if we were to run this code over here, you can see that we will not get any error message and our code works as expected. So here without using entity framework, we have basically added on a new column. We added it to the database first and then to our code over here, and we made it nullable because this makes sense. If you were to do a select on this, you can see that city over here for existing values is null. So this is one way of doing it with your entity framework, where you are adding in new column after your initial creation of the database. In other explanations, we will look at migrations and how do we automate this and version track our database and our code. So I'm using entity framework here, and I added this city property to this class. So what I want to do is I added this manually, but now I want to remove it manually. So here in the database, you can see the students table has city column in here. So what I can do is in order to remove this, I can just right click on that, select the delete option, and then press OK to remove that column. So this is using SQL Server Management Studio. I've got my city property added to this class, so I want to remove that, and there you are. We are now back at square one. So if I run my program, you can see that I do not get any error messages when it does execute. So here I've got the desired output that I wanted without any issues. So the entity framework simply works. Now this is without any migrations as such. So there's no migrations that have been included for entity framework. I added city field manually and I removed it manually. So you can see that it has disappeared from here. And if I refresh this, you can see that it's not added any new columns over here. So in the next explanation I will do, which is where we look at migrations and what do we need to do to get started with migrations with entity framework in C#. So let's talk about migrations and entity framework. So here, as you can see, we are using the entity framework core here. Whether you're using core or the full version, the migration concept pretty much stays the same. So what is migrations? Why do we actually use it? So here, as you can see, this is the main program that I have that has a class called student. And what it's doing is it's got something really special called DB context. This is the class that you inherit from. So I'm inheriting from this class into this class, which is school context. Within this school context, we are passing a DB set, which is of type student. So what is type student? That's basically my class over here with three properties: ID, name, and age. And then it's very simple to use entity framework. So we just basically derive from this class, inherit from this class, create a class called school context. I'm keeping the naming convention the same. So just call it context because that's DB context. So I'll keep it the same. In here, we have a DB set, and within the one configuration method, which is inherited from DB context, we are overriding it. So we basically want our own method for this. And in here, we want to pass in our own code. So in here, I'm just using SQL Server and I'm using a twisted connection. And that basically connects to my instance over here. So here's the database students and these are the columns. So where do migrations come in is the very first time I create this, I use this method called EnsureCreated. So what this does is it uses the context. And what is the context? It's the new school context class that I have. And it's calling a method called EnsureCreated. All that does is it ensures that my database has, first of all, there is a database called school. And within the school database, there's a table called student. And that student table has the following columns within it. So what the entity framework allows you to do is basically create the initial fields over here so that you don't have to use this method over here. So this method was just a temporary kind of, quick turnaround to get this in, but ideally we don't want to use this method, and we want everything to be in our control in terms of creation of the database, creation of this table, and when we want to add in a new field or column, we want to track that. So this is where Entity Framework has a concept of migrations, and that's what we are going to discuss next. So the way you need to think about Entity Framework is it's there to help you connect to the database and give you the ability to write to the database and link that up with your classes in the code. So for example, if I have a student class here, what Entity Framework will do is if you set that as a DB set over here, it will go ahead and create that table for you. So basically you don't have to worry about creating tables in the database manually. So here, for example, if I connect to this local database, you can see that this is the school database, and within here I have table called DBO students. So this was created by Entity Framework for me, including the columns that are created within here. So I did not have to manually go into the database to create this. This is because the Entity Framework has several ways of doing this, but I used something called EnsureCreated. What this did was it checked the SQL Server instance over here. It ensured that there was a database called school. If there was not a database called school, it would create it, and then it would do the same with students table. If not there, then create it, and same with any columns within here. So then it also manages things like connecting to the database for you, because you specify the connection here, and it will initiate, open, and close connections when needed. For example, if you are checking to make sure the SQL Server has the database table and columns, it will check that, open the connection and close it. And same here, it will check for any records. If not, then add the following records in. And it takes care of when you're querying the data, it will connect and manage that connection for you. And its job is by using the students here, class over here, it's able to work out what properties columns in the database exist, and those then can be queried using the link over here. But one part that we want to do is we can't simply add a new column here and for it to automatically appear within the students table over here. So if we want to do that, then there is a concept called migrations. Now we could do this manually. So we could, as shown in my previous explanations, you can do this manually by simply adding a new column within in here and then going back here and updating your class. But what we want to do is we want to add the new column here, or a new property, and then the Entity Framework to go ahead and automatically create the new column within here, within the database, and also track when we add new things to the database, so that we can back out a change if we don't like it, or if we want to back it out and then put it back in. So we're able to upgrade and downgrade as we please. That's where migrations come in, and they become really handy without you having to manually create columns within here. You can just use your code to create a column in here and manage it through migrations. One of my favorite features of Entity Framework is its ability to create databases, tables, and columns within the table. So for example, here you can see that I have a database called school. Here I have a table called students. So if I were to delete this table over here, so if I right click and delete, and if I select, so that's the table that we are going to delete, and press OK, so that table has now been deleted. So here I'm back in VS Code, and you can see that here when we set up the DB context, which is basically your scaffolding to create everything, we have something called DB set. How I would think of DB set here is as a command to create a table. All this is doing is taking in a class of students. So you can see this is the class I have created, and we have everything that we need to create a table, because we've got the field name over here, and we've got the data type. So here you can see the data type, string, int, and int here for ID. So we have everything that we need to create a basic table. So if I just run this code, what you will see is as soon as the program starts, I am using a command over here which says ensure database is created. So you've got context, and I'm using database, and then ensure created. Context comes from over here, and that's the new school context. So what is the new school context? If we come down here, you can see the school context is over here, and this is where we are defining our table, and it's using this class over here. So if I were to run this, and you can see it will magically create the database for you. So here we've got the output that we have. If I go back to SQL Server Management Studios, you can see if I refresh this, and you'll see a new table that has just appeared over here, and you can see it has some records as well. These records have been populated because in the code over here, I am checking to see if there are any records. If there are none, then basically add in the 3 dummy records that I want. Let's understand this EnsureCreated method over here. This method comes from context database EnsureCreated. So the context is actually database context. So you can see here DB context. This is part of entity framework. So the purpose of this method is it ensures that it creates the database if it does not already exist. So for example, here you can see I'm passing it a database connection, and I'm passing it a database name called school. So if this database doesn't exist, what EnsureCreate does is it creates the database for you. It creates the database and all the tables based on your model classes. So if we have a look at this, so here is our class. This is DB set is our model of students that we want created within the database. Only works when there are no pending migrations. So this method only works if you do not use migrations and there are no pending migrations. So this is important to understand. And if you don't know what migration is, then I will explain this at another time. So here it is also important to understand that it doesn't use migration system. So we can just basically use this within our testing, and we can, for example, give this code to another developer who can take this and run it on their computer. As long as they have a local instance of SQL Server installed, then it will go and create the school database and also the student table without any problem at all. So EnsureCreated, basically its purpose is to create any database and any objects, including any columns that are not there. So first it will create the database for you, then it will create the student table, and then within the student table, it will create the relevant columns. Of course, when the table is created, it needs to know which columns exist, so that's all done in one SQL statement. The only important bit to understand is it doesn't use the migration system. So we can see EnsureCreated has the following features, which is it will create the database and tables for you depending on your model classes, such as DB set. So if we have a look at our code over here, we can see we are declaring a DB set, essentially a table of students. Student is the class, which we've defined here. So you can see my database already has a students table in here. So let's say now that I delete this table. If I select this table, students table, and delete it, so this has now disappeared from our SQL Server environment over here. So now what we'll do is we'll go back to VS Code, and within here you can see that my main method is here. This is where I'm creating a school context. So this is going to be over here. So this is our public class. So what we're doing here is we're creating a new instance of it, and once this is created, we can use the context, which is this variable here, access the database property, and then call the EnsureCreated method. So this will hopefully create the table for us. Now, even if the database didn't exist, so our database is called school, it would actually go ahead and create the database for us as well. So as you can see here in Management Studio, we don't have the database here. So what we'll do is go back here and simply by running this code, so this will be useful if you run this code on a machine that doesn't have the database or the table created, EnsureCreated over here will go ahead and create that table for you. And you can also notice I'm adding in some dummy records. So I'm checking if the context student has any records. If it doesn't, then basically add the following 3 records within the database table. So we'll run this, and the code is just running and it's finished. So now we can see some records have been added in. So we are making the assumption the table would have been created. So if we go here, what we can do is we can just select the tables and refresh, and we should find the students table in there. And if I do the top 1000 rows, and you can see our database table exists. Going back to EnsureCreated, so you can see ensure the database and the table is created. So So that's the purpose of EnsureCreated. It creates the database and all the table based on your model classes DB sets. So here, as you saw, we have a DB set of students. They went ahead and created that for us. So you've got yourself an entity framework application. So this one is a very simple application. We just have a student class that is converted by the entity framework into a table in the database. So if, for example, we have a look at the database, you can see there is a table called students. So if I do select top 1000 rows, and in here you can see this is our simple table with ID field, name, age, and this is the students table. So you can see entity framework have created that from this class, which is ID, name, and age. And just by using the simple command here, it has done this. So how do you add a new field? One way you could do is manually add everything. But if we add a new field here, so here we're adding a field called city of string data type. So if I were to run this program and see what happens, and what you get is you get this long error message, but at the beginning of this error message, it says invalid column name city. So why does this error actually happen? So if we have a look at what's actually happening within the main method, so you can see within the main method, we're calling a method called EnsureCreated. So what this does is, for the very first time, if the relevant table, which is the student table, isn't there, then this will create it. Now there is another option in here, which is you can use the EnsureDeleted method here. Then what this will do is this will delete the table first and then recreate it. But the issue with EnsureDelete is you will lose your data. So anything that you add in your database, you will lose it. So you'll have to populate it again. So here, for example, I've just got some seeded data, which is always added if a table is empty. So this will seed our data. So it's checking, are there any records? If there are, then it will do nothing. But if there aren't any records, it will add that. So if I run this program now, again, with EnsureDeleted, what you'll find is that the table is added and we do not get any error messages. The only thing to watch out for is I have enabled a null for this city field because we haven't specified any data within here to say what values city should hold. So if I go back to my database here and refresh this, now notice here, previously we only had these columns within here, so ID, name, and age. But now if I do another select and we now have a city column, and notice all the values are nulls because we have added the null indicator, which is a question mark, to this data. So now how do we get around this problem? Well, rather than keep on dropping our table and recreating it, this will cause problems in production. So there's now a concept called migration, which we will look at next.